Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
Dave, we're back in Plato's Cave. Do you know what Plato means? That was actually a nickname for Plato. That was not his real name. You know what Plato means in ancient Greek?
What does Plato mean in ancient Greek?
I mean, you're going to love this. It means wide back. Plato was, I don't remember all the levels. The elite athletes were the Olympians, but then there was a class right below, and that's what Plato was, and he wrestled. So I always like to make jokes. Two of my heroes, Plato and Abraham Lincoln, were both fighters of sorts.
Is that what inspired your past as a powerlifter?
That's it. Plato and Lincoln. You know, who knew? They were both kind of badasses.
Love it.
So we're here in Plato's Cave, named after wide back Plato, and here to help you. We're basking in the glow of the amber light. It's almost like there's a fire burning behind us, and maybe some shadows being cast on the walls of the cave.
People don't know what this looks like. There's a light off to our corner.
Yep.
That we do our best to not let the cameras see, but it is kind of the light outside of the cave. It's the true light.
It's like the entrance to the cave, right?
Right. Well, and that's going to be what we continue to do every week is try to help people find their way out of the cave by learning to think like the philosopher. Right. Learning to think like Plato would have, or Locke would have, or Jaffa would have, or our founders would have.
Well, and it's a challenge because when you grow up in the cave, I mean, this is part of the imagery that Plato offers. All you're used to is looking at the shadows. To you, the shadows seem real if you've never seen anything else. If you've never been able to turn around and see that there's a fire and see that there are people carrying all kinds of artifacts. If you've never walked outside the cave and actually you think that the shadows are real. And so much what passes for news today really are just more shadows. There's just more shadows to keep us, entertained.
Well, that's distracted. Really, there is that thought of where do the shadows come from? And the shadows in today's modern world are coming from the politicians who are messaging through the media.
Yep.
So you have the politicians, you have the media, and you have education, really where John Dewey got this whole progressive movement started. You have those three people painting this picture of what is the world we want you to see look like? Right? What do these shadows on the wall, the world we want you to believe is true, what does that look like? And that creates this really intense challenge for us and for others who are trying to find their way out of Plato's cave, out of the cave in Plato's allegory. How do you figure out? Wait, I'm not supposed to believe that's not accurate.
I'm gonna throw out one example. You mentioned education, and it's just a great place. It's a great place to start. Many of our members are familiar with the controversy surrounding education in general, but especially public education. And at the center of public education are public teacher unions.
Right.
And so what you find in the news, the kinds of controversies typically revolve around what the curriculum is going to be or not be, or some kind of book that some people want to be included or they don't want to be included. These guys, or possibly pay, what the pay is for teachers. And all of those are shadows. All those are distractions. When you really dig into it, what you find what teacher unions are really all about, in a way, the whole public education system it's a giant laundering operation. It is a way for the political class, politicians in state legislatures, in Congress, they're looking at all these productive Americans, right? Working, earning money, saving money. And those greedy politicians are thinking, man, we wish we could just take the money from these Americans and use them for our own campaigns, use them so that we can get elected over and over and over. Now, they're not brazen enough to do that. They're not going to just come take your money and use it for their own campaigns.
Sure.
But what they will do is they'll take your money in the form of taxes and they'll pay it to public teachers
Right.
and other government employees. Those government employees then have some of that money gets taken from them by the unions. Right. And the unions turn around and give it to the politicians.
Right.
It's all laundered. It's all clean, right? Most people don't realize that you're actually helping to pay for the re-election campaigns of all kinds of politicians that you don't even like. You don't want them to get reelected, but you're paying taxes, and your taxes go to government employees, and those government employees, if they're unionized, that money is ending up funding the campaigns of typically progressive Democrat politicians.
Well, and let's not forget the next step they took after that. So for a while, it was just that, right? And the unions would cut a check to these politicians for their reelection campaigns because they all knew it was going to make them all rich and it was going to get everybody the money they needed.
Yep.
And I'm talking more about the administrators of the public teachers unions. That's not the teachers themselves, the ones sitting in the classroom. They're not getting rich off of this. It's the bureaucrats of the teachers union, right?
Right.
I mean, they're all bureaucrats that are all causing this problem.
There used to be a great phrase to describe those types: union bosses. That's what they used to be called.
So, and then you had the whole union boss mafia. Where's that line?
Right.
But take that a step further. So what happens, right? You have those unions giving back, and then you have well-meaning Americans saying, you know what? I don't like that you can do that. Mm-hmm. I'm going to make sure that my candidate has the same funding that you do. And I'm just going to cut my candidate a check. Perfect example, Henry Salvatore with Ronald Reagan, right? The unions were against Ronald Reagan. They didn't want that. So Salvatore came along and said, yeah, you know what? No, forget it. I'm going to make sure you have enough money. So what do these people do? They say, well, wait a minute. Let's start creating campaign finance regulations. Let's create campaign finance laws. This is one person can't give you all that money. But when you're a union, you can distribute the money to all the members of the union, and each member of the union can give $200 or $400 or $1,200, whatever they've decided that max number is.
Right.
So now all of a sudden you have this really organized union that each member can give a little bit, and it doesn't appear that these unions are laundering the money for the campaigns, but in actuality they're preventing that other person. So all these people who are advocating for free and fair elections by creating campaign finance laws, all they're really doing is creating favoritism for the incumbent.
The incumbents, for the political class, absolutely.
And that's the reason that incumbents win such a high majority of the time.
Yep, upwards of 90% and higher, meaning, for example, if you're in the United States Congress today, it is a rare, most members of Congress, and I'm talking about both the Senate and the House of Representatives, it is, if you're in the Congress, it is far more likely that you will either retire or die in office from old age than it is that you'll actually get defeated in an election. You know, get booted out.
Well, and now we're getting to the weekend at Bernie stage, where you keep electing the guy even though he's already dead or mentally gone.
Yep.
We're sort of looking at Joe Biden.
You know, and this problem exists at the state level in all the states, all 57 of them. If you're Barack Obama, also at the federal level, there are hundreds of thousands of federal employees who are part of government employee unions, and those unions take money from federal bureaucrats and use it to fund the campaigns of typically progressive Democrats. When I remember after 9/11 and when Congress started talking about creating a TSA, our younger members might not remember, before 9/11 there was no TSA, and in fact most security was done by private contractors. And I could see the writing on the wall. I know why they want to create a TSA, because it's going to create a huge number of federal employees that will be unionized, and that's just more laundering of more tax dollars back to Democrats.
Little funny story on the side of that. I was telling, I think it was my nephew or one of his friends, it was somebody younger, about when I was in high school and I went to Israel. And all of our parents, we went with a big group, and all of our parents came and met us at the gate. And he looked at me and he said, wait, how did they come meet you at the gate? and it was just one of those things. I mean, I think about technology and that kind of stuff that they're not used to, but it was unfathomable for somebody younger to say to me, wait, they were able to just come and meet you at the gate. You were able to walk. I used to take people to the airport and I'd walk them to the gate.
All the time. And watch them get on their plane, stand there in the window, right, and see them back away from the gate, right? And
the couples who are saying their goodbyes and crying. I mean, that was part of the airport experience.
That's right.
And now it's over.
Yeah. So to our bigger point here, we've trotted out this idea of teachers and government employees in general and the unions that represent them and what that's really all about. And yet you can watch hundreds of hours of CNN and MSNBC and read the New York Times and read the Washington Post, and you're not going to get that. What they're going to do is they're going to trot out one controversy after another, and try to get you engaged in the details of those controversies. Those are really the shadows on the wall.
Right.
The big, gigantic problem for someone who has seen the light is the fact that there are all these government employees who are unionized, who are sending our tax dollars after it gets laundered in the form of salaries back to the political class.
And so when you take that and add to it the campaign finance regulations, it brings up an interesting conversation. And I think this is one of the first conversations we should have today based on what's happening in the public conversation.
Yeah.
And that is this whole line that there are I think we heard just over 75 or just over 76% of Americans today think that election problems are a threat to our democracy.
Yeah.
All of the problems. So it's this huge percentage because you have nobody really trusting elections, and you have people saying, on one side, Trump is trying to undermine our elections by calling into question and what he said on January 6th and all of these things, and you have the other side saying, wait a minute, you're using fake ballots and dead people are voting and all of these things. And our government officials, our elected representatives are sitting here saying to us, all of these things are a threat to our democracy.
There's even a January 6th commission that's still assembled, and their whole point is January 6th represented that was a great threat to our democracy. We have to save. Dave, don't you want to save democracy?
No.
No.
No, but truly, I mean, so we have this whole conversation happening right now, and politicians on both sides have created this narrative of there is a threat to our democracy. That threat to our democracy, what they call the current threat to our democracy, that they have all of a sudden decided is the major conversation that all people should be having leading into the 22 and 24 elections.
Yeah.
They're acting as if it's a current problem. That's a shadow on the wall. It's a distraction. It's not real. Where were the Democrats and where were these elected representatives when our democracy was being destroyed in the 1960s by the creation of unelected, nameless, faceless bureaucrats who run our everyday lives?
Yeah, I mean, so this is another great example here of why we call this program Plato's Cave. I mean, you laid it out perfectly. The shadows on the wall is this repeated narrative over and over. There's a threat to our democracy. There's a threat to our democracy. Clearly, the unspoken premise is democracy is really good.
Yeah.
Democracy is really important. It is one of the most precious. Our democracy is one of the most precious things we have, and any threat to it is a great, grave danger. That's the premise. And yet, when you start peeling back the layers of the onion, so to speak, when you turn around from in the cave and you start walking out into the light of the day, first of all, you see this huge problem you just put your finger on. For those who say they care about democracy, we've had nothing close to a democracy. You mentioned the 1960s, and that's when Lyndon Johnson launched his whole Great Society.
Right.
And Johnson really was following the lead of Franklin Roosevelt before him, who was following the lead of Woodrow Wilson before him. I mean, this problem stretches back over a century. We have the political class, the progressive political class, has been slowly, gradually, but consistently replacing constitutional self-government with unelected bureaucratic government, with an administrative state. If anyone stands up and says, I really care about democracy, the first response should be, so you want to get rid of all unelected bureaucracies, right?
Right.
Because an unelected bureaucrat issuing regulations telling us how to run our businesses and educate our children and what medicines we may or may not take or have to take, right? That certainly is not democracy.
I was just going to say, I mean, wear a mask, get an injection, give children an injection. Doesn't matter what their parents say, what anything else. I mean, that is the class of bureaucrats and the control and the level of control that they have.
If someone says that they really care about democracy, here's a really important, simple, foundational concept today. The purpose of physicians is to offer advice on our health. That is the purpose of physicians. And whether we choose to follow the advice of our physician or not is really kind of up to us. The purpose of physicians is not to decide what liberties and rights we enjoy as citizens. That's not their job. And the moment they start acting like our masters who decide what privileges they will allow us to indulge and what restrictions and prohibitions they're going to impose on us, that's the farthest thing from democracy. And then when you dig in even deeper, you walk farther outside the cave, you actually get into the light of day, you realize we've never had a democracy. In fact, we quite purposefully, we Americans, we rejected democracy because democracy is just tyranny of the majority. Yeah. It's just the many deciding what they're going to do with the minority. And the view from the founding stretching all the way through today, at least among those of us who care about liberty, the idea was let's create a government based on the consent of the governed, a government that is authorized by the people and protects the individual rights of each and every citizen. That's not a democracy.
Right.
A democracy, there's a famous old line. Democracy is two wolves and a sheep
right.
voting on what they're going to have for dinner, right? And of course, the two wolves are going to vote to have lamb for dinner.
Right.
Have pork chops, Wait, not pork. You don't get pork chops.
Lamb
sheep.
chops.
Lamb chops. There you go. Yeah.
Lamb and a sheep is the same, right? I think so. I was just at the National Western Stock Show. I should know these things.
You should know this.
I have to use that as a little aside.
Yeah.
One of our members took me to the Junior Rodeo Livestock Auction.
Okay.
I watched a sheep or a lamb, one of the two. I think it was a sheep.
Yeah.
Sell for $41,000.
Wow.
You talk about value and demand.
Yeah.
I mean,
that must
talk
have been
about
one
just
special
a true,
sheep.
Yeah, just a true. It was the grand champion of the. And now this is where actually some of the interesting conversations about the Vino and Veritas Society come in.
Yeah,
this was the Junior Rodeo Livestock Auction. So the prize-winning cow went for $161,000. It was a stock show record.
Yeah,
but these are all animals that are exclusively raised by and taken care of by children living on ranches. So everybody knows that this is, the money is going to the kids. Some of the money gets set aside for different programs for junior livestock and junior rodeo achievement programs and things like that. And we have talked for a long time about how there are people, many, many, many Americans who are willing to help and make things happen for charitable purposes just because they believe in the cause. You don't have to have government solving all of the problems. Mm-hmm. And this is one of them. There are ranchers and people who are buying these animals. They're buying these cows because they want these cows to come in and become part of their herd for reproduction, for meat, for whatever else. When you're doing that, they know the importance of creating a continued legacy with more kids coming up and doing that. So they spend a little bit extra. They go a little bit further and a little bit above and beyond. That same cow, if it was raised by you or I, and we just brought it in and it was even if it was just, the quality was just as good, they're not spending $160,000 on the cow or $41,000 on the goat.
It's a charitable effort in part.
Correct.
There's some self-interest, right? Or if I understand correctly, there's some self-interest on the part of the farmers and the ranchers who buy these animals. But there's also a charitable spirit involved. And it certainly is true throughout American history. The American people have been, they've been the most generous people in the history of the world.
Sure. When
you look historically, no nation of people has given as much as the Americans give, and they still give an enormous amount, upwards of the tune of about $500 billion a year those are donations that are actually recorded, right? So
Right.
these are IRS tax records that we have. It doesn't include the millions of instances where a friend or a sibling or someone gives $10 to help out a friend or something. In other words, something not recorded. That it doesn't include that.
And this is one of those circumstances, right? That this wasn't necessarily a charitable donation,
Right.
But they wanted to encourage those kids to continue their pursuit of agriculture and,
Right.
and their continued interest in the ag industry, and they were willing to spend a little bit more to make sure that they were continuing to keep those kids interested. So that's another one of those things that's not necessarily recorded by the IRS. That was a huge tangent. Should not have taken us down there. We were talking about two wolves and a sheep and democracy.
Yeah.
And that's the right thing, right? We are not a democracy. And I said, when I said at the very beginning, the threat to our democracy and that 76+% of Americans think that we currently are dealing with an intrinsic threat to our democracy.
Right.
Those are the people paying attention to the shadows on the wall.
Right.
The real conversation is, if you want to be a democracy, what are the restraints that should be on that democracy? And that's the conversations that are happening in the marketplace of ideas that we talked about over the last 2 weeks. When you get out of the cave, when you meet other people who are in the sunlight,
Right.
and you're participating in the marketplace of ideas, you're actually engaging in conversation, you have this whole new realization that, wait a minute, I don't know if I care that all of these things that are happening are really a threat to our democracy, because we're not a democracy, nor should we be.
And think of how this changes the national conversation. If we could make this very subtle shift, imagine if we stopped talking about threats to our democracy and we started talking about threats to our constitutional republic.
Right.
Now that focuses our attention on the Constitution, right? Our constitutional republic revolves around the Constitution. That means anything that is a threat to the Constitution is a threat to our constitutional republic. And then if we started looking around and asking, well, what are the threats to our constitutional republic? It turns out the biggest threats to our constitutional republic is not a group of hoodlums who trespassed into the Capitol building and broke some windows and vandalized some things last year. The biggest threat to our Constitution is an entire entrenched political class who routinely ignores the Constitution, mocks the Constitution, exercises all kinds of powers nowhere granted by the Constitution. The very premise of our Constitution. This is one of these things, it's so fundamental, and yet so many Americans either never knew this, never heard it, or they forget about it because they're distracted by the shadows on the wall. The very premise of a constitutional republic is that our government, those in government, have precisely the powers that we, the people, have delegated to them. No more, no less. That's it. If there's ever a question, well, do members of Congress, for example, have a certain power they want to exercise? Do they have the legal authority, the constitutional authority to do something? The answer is, well, did we, the people, grant that power to them? And to make things simple, we wrote it down in the Constitution. Here are the powers that we, the people, grant to the members of Congress. And what we start to learn is there have been great threats to the Constitution, to our constitutional republic, building over the course of a century and a half. To the point that this is an episode in modern history that kind of it symbolizes, it enshrines this constitutional crisis in which we find ourselves when what we call Obamacare, it was actually called the
Affordable Care Act.
Affordable Care Act originally. When that was in Congress, before it passed, Nancy Pelosi was she was being interviewed. She was talking with journalists, and they asked her about these constitutional problems. Where does Congress get any power to start regulating things like health insurance and commanding people that they must take out health insurance, all these things that Congress had never done before? And her response, she said, the Constitution, are you kidding? And she laughed. She laughed. Clearly, right? Her point was, we're in Congress. We don't care about the Constitution. That is completely irrelevant. If we have a majority, if we can get the votes, we do whatever we want to do. Now, right there, that is a grave, serious danger to our constitutional republic. All the talking heads in the media who are promoting one unconstitutional program after another, one unconstitutional agency after another. So for those people who say, well, I'm really concerned about our democracy, let's talk about our constitutional republic. And the first things that need to happen, we need to start abolishing and repealing, getting rid of some of these unelected, bureaucratic, unconstitutional agencies, getting rid of some unconstitutional laws and policies and programs.
It's funny because Nancy Pelosi says that about Obamacare when the Constitution's inconvenient for her.
Yeah.
But then along comes Trump, and she spends 4 years telling us that we're in a constitutional crisis.
Right.
Right? I mean, the Constitution is only important to her when it benefits her in some form or fashion.
What you notice among progressives, I mean, I'm old enough to have seen this with my own eyes as an adult. There have been two occasions when progressives become really interested in the actual Constitution. And that's when a president's being impeached or can be impeached. And if it's one of their guys, if it's Bill Clinton, well, then they become originalists and they want to argue based on the original meaning of the Constitution. I want to remind our members, these are people in the political class who spend most of their time mocking the Constitution, ignoring the Constitution, talking about how the Constitution's irrelevant, it's outdated, we shouldn't care about it, until Bill Clinton gets impeached. And then, by golly, the Constitution really matters for a brief moment in time. Yeah. And they trot out their constitutional scholars to say, well, what Bill Clinton did really is not an impeachable offense. And then fast forward when Donald Trump is facing impeachment, again, they get focused on the Constitution for a brief, because it serves their immediate political interests. Right. They think they can use the Constitution to impeach and possibly get rid of a president they don't like. But in the ordinary operations of government, especially when they have a majority, they pay no heed, no attention to the Constitution at all. This is one of the reasons why the founders designed in the Constitution an independent judicial branch. Because the judicial branch, if it's doing its job.
That's a big if.
That's a big if, and they haven't done it very well for the last 75 years. But if they were to do their job well, that's one of the things they're supposed to do. They're supposed to, when there are controversies that involve a law, they're supposed to look and see, is the law actually constitutional? This is the whole idea of judicial review. And the authors of the Federalist Papers, they defend the idea of judicial review precisely because they realize it's going to be tempting for the political class, especially the majority. It's going to be tempting to ignore the Constitution and exercise powers they're not supposed to. So they create this branch of government that is independent from the legislature and the executive, and they're supposed to uphold the Constitution and declare any laws that are passed that are unconstitutional. Make that known. Declare it to the American people. This is unconstitutional, and explain why.
Right.
And they've been asleep at the wheel for a long time in that duty.
Well, I think we need to come back to the judicial branch in just a minute. Because there's a whole conversation about the images being projected on the wall today about that too, and I think we need to get there. But because of my background in branding and marketing and advertising, I want to touch on that a little bit, on the democracy, the threat to our democracy. Why was it so important to Nancy Pelosi and to all the way back to Woodrow Wilson and FDR? Right. Why is it so important to them to get that phrase, to get that conversation to be the center point? As soon as we as Americans on an overwhelming scale, even the media, right? I mean, everybody. We have a lot of members who will swear by Fox News. We'll have a lot of members who will say, well, that's my news source and I trust them, and CNN is fake news and MSNBC is fake news, and they are. I'm not denying that. But Fox is also the one going out and doing polls saying, is there a threat to our democracy? And just that very question makes that the center point of everybody's conversation.
Yes.
So why does this matter to the left? Why does this matter to progressives? It matters because all of a sudden, they're Democrats. You have Democrats and you have Republicans. And all of a sudden now everybody in America thinks, well, you have the Democrats in a democracy and you have Republicans in a democracy.
Right.
So if we're a democracy,
one fits and one doesn't.
Right. But think about what it would be if there was a conversation is there a threat to our constitutional republic?
Yeah.
Well, now, why aren't Republicans actually worrying about, I mean, that's the conversation, Republicans. There is a threat to our constitutional republic. There is a threat to our Constitution. And if you have that angle, well, I want to be a Republican in a constitutional republic, not a Democrat.
Right.
Democrats, as the founders told us in the Federalist Papers, democracy is a threat to the republic. We saw the failures in ancient Greece and ancient Rome of a true democracy. We learned from that. And you just see that kind of, that branding, that marketing, where they're shifting the whole conversation. Now all of a sudden we're having a conversation of, well, Democrats are fighting for democracy, and they're fighting for what they claim to be democracy, even though they're really just saying, well, elect us and give us all the power. And that's why Nancy Pelosi talks a lot about, we're just doing what the people want. We're pleasing our constituents.
Right.
It's the will of the people. And I have to have these conversations, and you have to have these conversations all the time with people who are telling us, well, but how could you not want healthcare? We have to care about all the people. And if there's people who aren't getting that, or who aren't getting a shot, or who aren't wearing a mask, they're a threat to everybody else, and the majority should have the power to control them. And that's the exact opposite premise of what the country was founded on. And they've been able to do this because there are those three stages of people who are controlling the shadows on the wall.
Yeah, I think your point here emphasized sort of the branding, the marketing of these phrases. It really does mean much if we can shift the attention to a democracy. A democracy, it really does mean the majority doing whatever they want to do. There's nothing intrinsic to the concept of democracy about any sort of limitations other than majority. It's not a minority. It's if it is a minority, if there's a powerful minority that is able to lord over and control the majority, then we call that an oligarchy.
Right.
Right? Or maybe some kind of aristocracy. But if it's the majority ruling and governing and controlling the minority, that's a democracy. And this idea has cut so deeply into the intellectual fabric of the United States. It's not only a common talking point among ordinary citizens, even some very serious, intelligent, wise, thoughtful constitutionalists fall into this kind of rhetorical trap. I mentioned, it was either one or two podcasts ago, an important speech that Antonin Scalia gave. This was back in the mid-1990s.
Yeah.
And my professor, Harry Jaffa, wrote a lengthy critique of the speech. And it was a very problem. This is Antonin Scalia. He's one of the heroes among conservative constitutionalists, one of the sort of the gurus of the Federal Society. And he gave a speech in Rome at the Gregorian University, and he described the United States as a democracy. And he said, now, once you accept the democratic theory, as the Americans have, you can't talk about the rights of the minority. He says the rights of the minority are whatever the majority decides they're going to be, if any. He said that's democracy. And his point was, don't blame me. I'm just telling you that's what democracy is. If you don't like that, then don't have a democracy. And he was being highly critical of the United States. He was describing the United States in this kind of model. And so it feeds into that notion of a democracy. I have found it curious myself. You almost never hear progressive Democrats of any type, whether they're ordinary citizens or they're journalists or they're politicians, you almost never hear progressive Democrats talking about our republic.
Right.
Or a constitutional republic. Never. But you will hear them frequently throw out this phrase, democracy. Our democracy and threats to our democracy, and everything's about democracy. And I think that notion of democracy lines up very well with the progressive notion of leadership.
Oh, yeah.
Because if a democracy has no intrinsic limits on it, right, the majority can do whatever they want to do, how are you going to get it done? A majority is a big mob of people. Who's going to orchestrate? Who's going to lead the way? That's the leader. So that notion of an unprincipled, unlimited power of a majority in a democracy really fits in nice with the leader of the democracy who's going to go implement the will of the majority. And all of that stands in striking contrast to the notion of a constitutional republic where every officer in the government, from the president to members of Congress to the Supreme Court, every constitutional officer has constitutional limited powers, not unlimited. This might be a shock to many Americans. No elected official takes an oath to implement the will of the majority.
Right.
None. What their oath is to uphold the Constitution, right? Do what the Constitution says to do. Don't do things that the Constitution doesn't. That's what they're supposed to do, is uphold the Constitution, not implement the will of the majority, because very often the will of the majority is an unjust will. Majorities very easily become mobs, and mobs become irrational and unjust and want to seek revenge and do all kinds of terrible, nefarious things. You know, the United States we witnessed a really ugly period in our own history where lynchings became frequent things, and they were horrific and they were terrible. That's democracy. When a group of angry citizens decides that guy did something wrong, whether he actually did or not, nobody really knows for sure. We're not going to wait to find out. We're going to go tie a rope around his neck and hang him from a tree right now. That's democracy in action. And I personally, I don't want anything to do with that. I would rather have a constitutional republic where we can find out, did that man actually commit a crime? If he committed a crime, he should be punished. But if he didn't, he should not be hung from a tree.
Right. There's an international relations, international affairs angle to this as well. If you remember through most of the late 80s, early 90s, there was a lot of conversation about spreading democracy around the world.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sure that there's been a lot more conversations about that throughout history. But there was this concerted effort that if we could just spread democracy throughout the world, that we would have less wars, we would have less violence. It was an easy contrast because people understood us as democracies. That's what educators were teaching. That's what schools, that's what the media. So you have that contrast with the Soviet Union.
And I just want to emphasize, I was saying before how this has cut so deeply into the intellectual fabric. And so, many conservatives, many Republicans have adopted this language. One of the foremost proponents of that view you're describing was George W. Bush.
Yes.
A conservative Republican giving speeches about how it's our duty as Americans to spread democracy to the Middle East and other places around the world.
And so it really did. It started really under Reagan quite a bit and continued all the way through Clinton and into Bush. And this idea of we need to spread democracy around the world. And by spreading democracy around the world, it was initially our way of combating the communist message of, it seemed like the opposite of socialism, of communism, of Soviet Russia. It seems today like the opposite of communist China. And what you really saw, there's been a lot of conversation about the imperialist United States. The United States wasn't always seen as an imperialist country. In fact, if you look throughout history, Britain and the Romans, and there have been so many countries that have had such a stronger imperialist approach than the United States ever did.
Big colonial empires.
Right. But the United States decided we were going to try to implement democracies around the world.
Right.
And we didn't see ourselves as imperialists, because by doing that, we're saying, no, we're not coming in and running your lives. We're just going to force you to have this kind of government, and then you guys elect people.
Right.
And then the elections were not legitimate, and you had all these questions. And in those places, you really were facing this threat to democracy, to their democracy. Yeah. But imagine what it would have looked like had, instead of doing a democracy in all of those countries, they said, you know what? We're going to help you institute a constitution. We want to help you create a constitution that protects individual rights. And
you know what the challenge there is, Dave? You would actually need a political class, including a State Department in the United States, who understands what a constitutional republic is, right? Before they could help people in other countries create a constitutional republic.
You're absolutely right. And I thought you were going to go in a different direction with what that challenge is. And that challenge is something else that you talk about constantly. And this is all credit to you. To be able to create that kind of a that kind of a government, you need a lot of individuals in government at the beginning who are not looking for power and wealth. You need the George Washingtons and the Ben Franklins and the Thomas Jeffersons and the Sam Adams and the Madisons and the Hamiltons and the Jays and everybody else who are willing to come together and all be there. It's not just one of them or two of them or four of them. It's all of them. You need that entire political class to be willing to sit back and say, okay, we're going to do what's best for the people, because we know in the end it's going to be best for us. It's going to be best for our children. It's going to be best for the country. And that just makes it so difficult to actually pull off.
This is hard. I think this is really difficult for Americans today to imagine, because when Americans today think of their government, they think of, first of all, you have visions in your head of the grand buildings, right? The Capitol building, the White House. But you also think of these circles of political elites, right? And they live in fancy houses, and they're the ones at the fancy cocktail parties, and they're exercising enormous power over the entire country. And they live these kind of lavish lifestyles. And of course, they exempt themselves from all their own rules, right? They'll tell all of us, don't go out to eat, don't socialize, while they go off to their fancy dinner parties and things like this. They're able to, government is so gigantic and collects so much money, spends so much money. They can set up all kinds of crony deals with their friends and their family members. If you're Joe Biden, you can give a bunch of money to a foreign government that then ends up paying Joe Biden's son $100,000 a month or some ridiculous
$31
thing.
million.
That wasn't the United States government in the beginning.
Yeah.
The United States government in the beginning was this tiny constitutional republic. Congress used to convene for somewhere around 6, 7, 8 weeks per year. That was it.
Yeah.
That was an entire session of Congress. Most sessions in the early Congresses, they started the week between Christmas and New Year's, late December. And very often before the end of February, they were done. That was it. And they all went back home. They went back to their farms. They went back to their job. Like, being in the political class was not a permanent job. It wasn't a permanent lifestyle. There was no big bureaucratic class, right, where you can just keep climbing the ranks and becoming, the high-paying salaries at the upper class of the bureaucratic group. None of that existed. And so when you think about a small constitutional republic, it's not going to pay you a lot of money. You're not going to have a lot of power because the government itself doesn't have a lot of power. You can't reward your friends and your family with crony favors. That attracts a very different kind of people.
Yeah.
It's going to attract some selfless people who are really interested in the good of the republic, versus when we create this gigantic, sprawling, progressive welfare state, subsidy state, regulatory state. Our government today attracts a very different kind of person, a very self-interested person. And that's one of the challenges of trying to export our form of government today to other countries. Our form of government today, right now, it's not very good. No. Any other countries, if they were wise, they wouldn't want what we have in the United States.
And I think that's the case. I think you see citizens of a lot of other governments, citizens of a lot of other countries who look at our government and then they start to say, yeah, you guys are imperialist. Because they look at it and they say, I don't want that. Mm-hmm. You guys are just as corrupt. You maybe are more corrupt than we are, and they're not wrong. To finish that dichotomy of spreading democracy versus spreading republics, I do think about it, though, in terms of what if Reagan had thought that through? What if all the way through, and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush,
right?
What if they had thought that all the way through? What if from the beginning there was never, the Republican Party never allowed the conversation of a threat to our democracy or the spread of democracy to happen? That they said, no, we are not going to allow the progressive left to change the conversation and make us think that we live in a democracy. We are going to continue the message of the founders, and we are going to maintain that we are a constitutional republic. And we were able to, let's just say in some hypothetical world, we were able to spread constitutional republics throughout the world. Yeah. And all of those constitutional republics were bound by the chains of their constitution, the way Jefferson talked about. That would have worked in terms of limiting war. That actually would have worked. Why? Because right now, all of those democracies all around the world, including Putin, who is elected, and for those who are listening and not watching, I'm using air quotes, right? You have Putin, who is elected. You have Kim Jong-un, who is technically elected, I think.
Right.
You have these people, and they're saying, the will of my people is that the Russians dominate the world.
Yeah.
The will of my people is that the North Koreans are separate from the rest of the world, and we don't interact with anybody, and we will bomb anybody who we want to. And this war that we're about to start, the Russian war on the Ukraine that they're about to start, that they're lining up their tanks for, that's the will of the people. They can say the Russian people want this. Doesn't make it right. If they were a constitutional republic that said you only have these limited powers, and unless it's in the self-defense of the individual, you can't go to war.
Be a whole different situation.
We'd be looking at a totally different world.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And this is, again, to give credit to the founders. They weren't perfect. Here at the Vino and Veritas Society, we never suggest that they were angels or gods or anything like that. They were wise. They were unusually wise. And even when they were wrong, one can learn much from studying their mistakes. And they understood very well the threat of democratic tyranny. They used that phrase. Jefferson uses that phrase explicitly in his Notes on the State of Virginia. He uses it in his Kentucky resolutions. And his point is democratic tyranny is just as tyrannical. It's just as unjust as the tyranny of one, right? An individual despot or tyrant. It's all tyranny. It means the most powerful, whether it's the most powerful one or the most powerful many, the most powerful using their power to violate the rights of others. And that can be internally within the nation. A democratic tyranny can violate the rights of the minority, and it can be on an international stage. They can violate the rights of people in other countries by waging unjust wars. I'm just going to throw this out. We don't have time to go into this in depth, but I want to point out in the Federalist Papers what I consider to be the theoretical peak, which comes in number 49 of the 85 essays. Madison makes the point, he makes the comparison that the model that they're using for a well-designed constitutional republic, the model is a mature, good, virtuous human being. Now, he understands that a government is different than an individual human being, but it's just the model. And in the case of a virtuous human being, what should rule within a virtuous human being? His reason.
Right.
His reason should rule over his will. His will shouldn't rule. I mean, anybody who's had an unruly, it's interesting when you think of that adjective, an unruly 2-year-old, right? What some child psychologists will call a willful child, right? Or a child with a particularly strong will.
Right.
You know that following your will is not a good thing. It's not necessarily a good thing. What parents of a strong-willed child desperately want is to cultivate that child's reason.
Right.
So that their own reason governs their will, governs their passions and their appetites and their desires. And so in describing the design and purpose of the Constitution, Madison says, we've done our best, the best we can, to create a government where the reason of the people controls the government, and then the government controls the will, the passion of the public. So, government helps to control the will of the people in things like criminal laws, right? The people sometimes have a will. They want to go violate the rights of others, murder and rape and theft and all kinds of terrible things. And the criminal law says, well, if you do those things, if you follow your will, the law is going to punish you. There's going to be a problem here. And so we want to control the will, govern the passions and the appetites, and be governed by our reason. This whole focus on democracy ignores that, completely ignores it, right? That conversation about reason governing over will is a conversation that happens out in the sunlight. That's a philosophic conversation. That's an insightful conversation. That's not the kind of conversation you find on MSNBC, right? What you're going to find from MSNBC are the shadows on the wall. Can you believe this person who was involved on January 6th, and they'll come up and I trot out some outrageous story. Someone said something outrageous on the internet or did something or whatever it is, hoping that that's going to distract you, right? That's what you're going to focus on. When the real conversation is we've lost to a large extent our constitutional republic. That's the great danger to our liberty.
And people should think through what does that look like, and what would the world look like? And yes, it's a little scary. There is that sense of, wait a minute, not being chained down. I'm not going back to the Matrix analogy that I gave 2 podcasts ago. I'm not being fed intravenously. I'm not being assured that I'm going to be safe and taken care of while the machines use my body for energy or whatever the whole story of the Matrix was. You have this risk involved in being a free, self-responsible individual and living in a free, self-governing society. But boy, oh boy, is it a whole lot more pleasant, and is there a lot more opportunity for growth and improvement and the building of quality of life, and not even just wealth or anything like that, but the actual quality of life. And for all the people out there who are, and I don't think this is a huge part of our audience, but there's a huge portion of people out there who are saying, oh, it's the billionaire class, and it's the corporate executives and all these people who make so much more money than their employees and everything else. That's all a result of the bureaucracies. Their ability to not really be there for employees, and their ability to not really be there for their customers, and to just take and rig things. And the best example out there right now, and we don't really have time to get into it, and I haven't done enough research on it, but I've been trying. I've spent about 2 weeks really researching this, is Blackstone. Blackstone became a major investor in Pfizer. The large shareholders of Blackstone have become extremely wealthy during this whole pandemic.
Sure.
And they're making major campaign contributions because they actually oversee in public employee unions.
Sure.
Blackstone has done all of these things, and it's that government bureaucracy that actually allows them to become wealthy.
Yeah, and they're investing in a company that has a near monopoly created by regulations. Right. Remember, there really is no such thing as a natural monopoly. What we call monopolies are all functions of government power. Government is the ultimate monopoly because government is the monopoly on legalized force. And only government can pass laws and regulations that say this business is free to operate, and we're going to prohibit anyone else from competing against them. Or we're going to make life so difficult that no one's even going to try to compete with that business. And so there's an anger out there at the corporate class, and part of that anger is justified.
Yeah.
Because there are productive, creative, hardworking entrepreneurs who get wealthy by creating wealth for others. And then there's the crony class of corporate billionaires, right, who get wealthy by understanding how the system, they can rig the system in their favor. And when I say system, I mean government.
Yeah.
I mean regulations. I mean subsidies. And that should be the attention. Where it really boils down to this, where you have wide realms of freedom, where people truly are free to do what they want with their property, to be creative, to run any kind of business that they want to run, to try to compete against big successful businesses if they want to. You tend to have little, I'm not going to say zero, you tend to have little corruption. You tend to have little injustice with it because you're fighting tooth and nail to keep your business going, even if you're a big business. You can't afford to be unjust and corrupt and treat people badly and treat employees badly, treat customers badly. But if you're getting some multi-million or multi-billion-dollar subsidy from government and you have a monopoly that's created by regulations, then you can treat your employees poorly and you can treat customers poorly because you've got a nice life for yourself.
It's really no different what these crony businessmen, these crony billionaires are doing. There's no difference between that and the political class. And that's why they're helping each other too, the same way these public employee unions are doing. It's all the same strategy. It's all the same approach. And by by limiting government, by going outside of the cave and ignoring those shadows on the wall. And those shadows can start by just encouragement from government, and then they get all the way into the regulations that really restrict us and say you have to do this.
When you say they're the same people, in some cases, literally,
Yes.
they're the same people. It's very common once you get up to the super big corporations. Who do they tend to hire? They hire people who have spent time in the regulatory agencies. And who do the regulatory agencies hire? People who've spent time in the corporations, right? So they all know each other. They run in these same circles. They work for each other, which is how they're able to help each other.
And back to the beginning of this podcast, the third person in that group are the heads of the public employee unions.
That's right.
How often are they running for office? And how often do we look at that as a credential for office, right? Somebody stands up and says, I've been the head of the largest public teachers union in the country, and now I want to be your next governor.
Right.
And we as
the
as
response
a people,
should be shame on you.
Right. But as people in general,
Yeah.
as a mob, as people who think we live in a democracy and that we should live in a democracy, think of that as some form of credential that says, okay, that's somebody I could support and I could vote for.
Right.
And it's crazy how these people get in a circle. Now, we've kind of run out of time, but we had talked about potentially the idea of getting into the courts. And you brought up the judiciary earlier.
Yeah.
We were going to talk about the judiciary a little bit. We don't have time to today. So I'm going to make a request on behalf of our members, because you and I have talked a little bit about this offline.
Yeah.
And you've had some really interesting thoughts about Justice Breyer's resignation,
Yeah.
About Clarence Thomas and Joe Biden's attack on Clarence Thomas, and now Joe Biden's saying, well, I need to appoint a black woman.
We have to have someone with black skin. I mean, it has to be a woman too, but I'm really interested in the part about the black skin.
Right. Which is no different than Obama when he appointed Sotomayor, said we have to have a Latina woman. And we've spent a lot of time on podcasts and in other opportunities. We've talked about, why does one person's background, I mean, unless it's the basis of multiculturalism, but why does one person's background do this? But you've had some really interesting thoughts. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. And I'm going to ask this in front of all of our members.
All right.
So you can't really say no anymore.
Okay.
We write a piece on it. And we'll either put it on our website or we'll decide where it's going to run.
Yep.
But we write a piece on it,
I will.
and because I think those ideas are really important to share, and they're important to share now.
Yeah.
I don't want to wait another week for a podcast before we do it. And if we can figure it out, maybe we can even have it out before this podcast goes out, and everybody will be laughing at me saying, oh, wait, he already did it. We already saw that.
We can give him some homework, Dave. We can ask him to read it before our next podcast.
Right. If you'll do that, I
I'll
think
do
that'd
it.
be great.
I will write something up. Absolutely. It's a great story, and maybe we can talk about it during the next podcast.
Excellent. Look
Okay.
forward to it. Until then, we'll keep guarding the American idea.
Nos sumos custodes.